Louise Dahl Wolff was born in San Francisco in 1895 as Louise Emma Augusta Dahl, as her mother believed that a child's initials should spell out a word. She studied to become a painter at the San Francisco Institute of Art, where one of the most important things she learned was color theory, led by Rudolf Schaefer, which came to be very important in her career. After the death of her father, she took up a job designing electric signs, when she met Anne Brigman, who introduced her to photography. The Great Depression was a huge economic downfall that began in the United States in 1929 and lasted until the late 30s. Personal income, tax revenue, and international trade were all affected. However, from this point onwards, things began to change for women. During this time, inspirational women were appearing in society as public figures, such as Mildred Didrikson, considered to be the greatest female athlete of all time, who won gold medals in the 30s in sports such as track and field, baseball, and basketball, all considered to be traditionally male sports. Frances Perkins, the first female cabinet member, advocated the 8-hour day, made laws for the protection of women and children in the labor force, and made safety laws stricter. The Second World War, spanning from 1939 to 1945, was a distinguishing point where women made a definite breakthrough into the working industry. While the men were at war, women were able to cover for them in the factories and found work as nurses as well as other roles in the emergency services. In the States, 13 million women were at work, which was roughly 25% of all women over the age of 14. This was also a time where the idealized American dream, a successful life without conflict or family strife, with a common nuclear family, a house in the suburbs and a nice car, seemed out of grasp and less likely to achieve. Women were not only responsible for caring for their family and the household, but also providing for them economically. Because of this, more women were seeking independence and remaining single. Advertisements being aimed at women featured women as mothers in the nuclear family unit, whereas those aimed at men featured women for sexual appeal. Even today, we think back on the 1940s and 50s as a prominent pin-up girl era, where the objectification of women being commonplace marked the beginning of media control and the consumption of stereotypes. These were further fueled by the male photographers of the time. Gain de Meyer, for example, photographed handsome rich women which were depicted in a slightly blurred, ethereal aesthetic. He liked to mimic silent movies of the time by veiling his lens in gauze and use soft backlighting. Edward Steichen was the first photographer to use electric light to make the images sharper and more readable than previous work of photographers. George Hoyningen-Hoon's work, depicting models seemingly carved out of marble on simple backgrounds, resembled Grecian idealizations, monumental and tranquil. Cecil Beaton was originally a stage designer for films and therefore worked in that way in the studio by creating mini sets for his shoots. However, he called himself technically inept when it came to photography. Countless other iconic male fashion photographers, still revered today, came from this time. The dominance of men in the field of fashion photography is one that still continues today, yet there were breakthrough figures, Louise Dahl Wolff included, who began to destroy this mold. The work of Eve Arnold, a female photographer famous for her misfits portraits of Marilyn Monroe, highlights the realities of being a woman at the time, and the repressive state behind the era's perfectly poised, almost robotic, glamorous representations of the female. In 1955, the first major exhibition of female photographer Lee Miller was held at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, curated by Edward Steichen. Lee Miller's journalistic work famously documents the women of war, but her fame as a photographer links to her involvement in the Surrealist movement. She travelled from New York to Paris to become the photographic assistant, as well as later the lover and muse, of Surrealist photographer Man Ray. The 50s was a time greatly affected by the Surrealist works of previous decades, a time that the photographers of the day would no doubt have studied and been inspired by. As a self-confessed frustrated painter, a Surrealist edge was sometimes incorporated into Dahl Wolff's images, like in this photo here. Another source of inspiration for Dahl Wolff was the photographer Anne Brigman, who was introduced to her by a friend. She invited Louise to her studio, who was amazed when she saw her recent shoot in the ice caves. Anne Brigman took photographs of nude women in natural, sometimes even animalistic environments. She was a firm believer of female liberation and used herself as the subject of many photographs. She was the reason Dahl Wolff decided to turn to photography, and where she got the idea to bring natural surroundings to fashion photographs. She cited Brigman's work as being pure art mixed with pure liberty. Her first camera was a 5x7 view camera with a wide-angle lens. Throughout her years as a photographer, Louise went through many cameras as they advanced in their technology. One in particular, the 7-pound Rolleiflex, caused her 3 worn-down vertebrae, a trip to the hospital, and a traction to relieve pressure on her skeleton. After these incidents, the doctors ordered her to balance her cameras on a tripod, which in her opinion was far too restrictive. Natural lighting was frequently used in Dahl Wolf's body of work, and her images have remained timeless, whilst reflecting the elegant style of the time she lived in. Louise Dahl Wolf was one of the first photographers to shoot colour fashion portraits in exotic locations such as North Africa and South America. Her choice of location shoots were to create a sense of leisurely activity and to connote a vision of the all-American woman in a wholesome, elegant and active lifestyle. Props were frequently positioned in her compositions, which suggested a narrative for the viewer. She was also known for being incredibly free-spirited and stubborn. At the start of Dahl Wolf's career, she was offered a great job at Condé Nast, taking portraits of prominent people for Vanity Fair magazine. She turned the job down, saying that, "I could never work in someone else's studio. I am of an independent nature and need my own surroundings." On assignment for a shoot during the peak of her career, Dahl Wolf was once taking photos of a society woman that she knew hated Franklin Roosevelt, yet she arrived at the shoot wearing a shirt covered in Roosevelt badges. Another example of Dahl Wolf's independence surfaced in an occasion with the art director in 1958, on a shoot for Harper's. The art director, a successor of Alexei Brodovich, simply looked through the viewfinder to see just how Dahl Wolf was going to shoot. No one had ever infringed on her territory or questioned her judgment before, and no one would ever do so again, as she quit her job at the magazine and went freelance to work with the competition at Vogue. After working for Vogue and contributing to Sports Illustrated for 2 years, she quit the fashion industry completely and retreated to the countryside, deeming it not worthy of her time. She was an inspirational photographer to men and women alike, stubbornly working by her own standards and creating a new style of fashion photography in the process. For any photographer to significantly change the popular style of fashion photography is a considerable achievement, but for a woman to have done so from the late 1930s is almost unimaginable. The fame and success of Louise Dahl Wolf was down to her style, grace and gut.